The courtroom was unusually packed that day. Spectators filled every bench, their whispers floating through the heavy air like static before a thunderstorm. At the center of the storm sat Karoline Leavitt, young, composed, and dressed in a simple navy suit that did little to distract from her piercing gaze and controlled demeanor. Asterisk, she wasn't a lawyer, at least that's what everyone thought. She had never stepped into a law school, never passed the bar, never worked for a firm. The only thing she had done was defend herself boldly, relentlessly. And with an intellect that no one in that courtroom was prepared for, asterisk, it all started with a fine, a seemingly trivial citation issued for unlawful protest. Karoline had been rallying a group against the misuse of surveillance technology in public spaces, especially in minority neighborhoods. Her protest had drawn attention, and not all of it positive. One of the city's senior judges, known for his strict interpretations of law and order, decided to make an example of her. Asterisk, she walked into court unrepresented. The judge smirked as she refused a public defender. "Are you sure?" he asked, the smugness in his voice hard to miss. "This isn't the kind of place for experiments." Asterisk, "I am not experimenting," she replied calmly. "I'm executing my right." Asterisk, what happened next turned the courtroom into a theater and Karoline into a legend. Asterisk, from her very first words, it was clear she had done her homework. But it wasn't just the law she understood, it was the rhythm of litigation. The dance of arguments and counter-arguments, the pauses that let a point breathe and sting at the same time. Asterisk. She challenged the arrest with such surgical precision that the judge was forced to call a recess to double-check the precedents she cited, all of which were obscure, irrelevant, inaccurate. Asterisk, the prosecution stumbled, unprepared for the title. Wave of citations, historical references, and constitutional arguments, Karoline unleashed with every statement. She wasn't loud, she wasn't dramatic, but every sentence cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. Asterisk, when the fine was issued. A hefty sum meant to deter such civil disobedience. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply asked for a printed copy of the ruling. The judge frowned. Then came the real storm. Within hours, she filed a countersuit, yes, filed against the arresting officer and the city itself, citing unlawful detainment, violation of First Amendment rights, and psychological trauma. Her documents were flawless. Even lawyers from the civil rights organization who caught wind of the case were in disbelief. Asterisk, who wrote this for you? One attorney asked her outside the courthouse. Asterisk, I did, she said. A silence followed, respectful, surprised, and a little afraid. Her reputation spread like wildfire. Soon law schools were talking about her. Students began reading her filings. One professor anonymously admitted that her understanding of constitutional law was borderline genius. Asterisk, but how had she learned all this? Asterisk, some claim she was a prodigy reading law textbooks in secret for years. Others believed she had been trained in private by a disgraced legal scholar. The truth, as she would later reveal, was far more impressive. Asterisk, I read, she said in an interview, and I remembered. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The law is like math with emotion. It's precise, it's powerful, and it's personal. Asterisk, when her case was appealed by the city, hoping to silence her through bureaucracy, Karoline represented herself again, and won again. She exposed a hidden clause in the city ordinance that had been inactive since 1982. She argued its applicability with such fluency that even the opposing counsel took notes. Asterisk, and the judge, the very one who had fined her, he apologized on record. Asterisk, that moment was historic, not because he was forced to, but because he chose to. He admitted that he had underestimated her, that he had approached the case with bias, that her intellect had shamed the very structure of this institution. Asterisk, Karoline didn't celebrate. She just smiled and thanked the court. That was only the beginning. The courtroom was quiet again, not because the case had ended, but because something new had started, a ripple through the legal world. The media, and especially through those who once laughed when they saw Karoline Leavitt walk in, unrepresented. Asterisk, but Karoline herself? She vanished. Asterisk. No press tours. No podcasts. No interviews. The story that should have made her a national icon turned into a myth because she refused to step into the spotlight. Asterisk. And that's when the world became even more obsessed. Asterisk. Whispers started online. A Reddit thread claimed she was running a secret legal forum under a pseudonym, teaching people how to defend themselves. Someone else swore they saw her speaking at a private debate club in Chicago, dismantling seasoned lawyers in front of Ivy League students. None of it was confirmed. Asterisk journalists knocked on every door in her neighborhood. Most got the same reply. Karoline. Oh, she keeps to herself. But one neighbor said something that caught attention. She's quiet, not because she's shy, because she listens to everything. Asterisk. That line stayed with people. It painted a picture not of arrogance, but of something far more dangerous strategy. Asterisk, in truth, while the world searched for Karoline outside, she was working from the inside. Deep inside a network of public case databases, obscure legal forums, and data leak sites. She was analyzing the law itself, not for power, but for weakness. Asterisk, she saw something most lawyers miss. The patterns how certain judges ruled similarly when pressured by corporate interests. How specific counties used obscure loopholes to suppress voter rights. Asterisk, how probation terms in low-income districts were deliberately written to trap people back into the system. Asterisk, to Karoline, the law wasn't just a system, it was a language. And like any language, if you learned its hidden grammar, you could rewrite reality. That's when she started the Shadow Files. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't even a website. It was a collection. Hundreds of annotated legal cases dissected and translated into plain language. To each file came with a breakdown. What went wrong? What should have been argued? Asterisk. How to beat it? Asterisk. These files started leaking into activist groups. One day, someone defending themselves in court for a housing violation used a word-for-word argument from a shadow file. The judge dismissed the case. Asterisk. Another week. A teacher fired unfairly won her appeal by citing a doctrine found in a buried footnote. One Karoline had highlighted in bright red in a shadow. File titled Weaponized Ambiguity, Education Law, and the Unseen Sword. It was like watching a ghost win trials. More people began asking, who is Karoline Leavitt? Really? Asterisk. So let's step back. Years before her courtroom debut, Karoline worked night shifts in a downtown records office. It was thankless, endless. Scanning of old documents, tagging case files, handling digitization for overworked clerks. She was paid little, spoke even less. But every night she stayed late, and she read every file, every annotation, every mistake. Asterisk. Her memory was photographic. Yes. But her focus? That was something else. She wasn't just memorizing statutes. She was studying the people behind the laws. What made them write what they wrote? Why they used certain words and avoided others? Asterisk. It wasn't about justice. Not yet. It was about understanding the enemy. Asterisk. When she finally left that job, no one noticed. No farewell. No party. But she took with her something more valuable than a law degree. An archive of over threes. Unusual cases that no one had bothered to analyze. Each one became a lesson. Each one a blade. Asterisk. By the time she walked into her own trial, she had already written 18 complete legal strategy playbooks, all 4 different scenarios: police abuse, municipal corruption, education rights, medical fraud, tenant retaliation. She was ready for a war the system didn't even know it had started. Asterisk. But why stay silent afterward? Why not use that fame to build a platform? Asterisk. Because Karoline didn't trust fame. Fame dilutes purpose. She didn't want interviews. She wanted impact. And the impact was happening. Quietly. Massively. In the span of a few months, over 40 self-represented defendants across 5 states won cases using fragments of arguments traced back to her frameworks. Legal aid centers unknowingly quoted her phrasing. Judges began encountering the same logical traps, phrased in different voices but built from the same blueprint. Asterisk. Someone at a law firm finally put it together. These people aren't copying each other, they said. They're reading the same script. Still, Karoline said nothing. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment, avoided smartphones, and used libraries instead of Wi-Fi. She didn't want to be found, not because she was hiding, but because she was watching. Asterisk. She knew her time would come again, and then it did. A new law was passed quietly in her city. A public behavior ordinance allowing law enforcement to detain anyone deemed visibly aggressive toward public infrastructure. It was vague, dangerous, and clearly designed to target protesters. Asterisk. Karoline didn't protest in the streets this time. She filed a surgical lawsuit, one that included a preemptive injunction, a statistical breakdown of citations filed under the previous, now appealed ordinance, a psychological study on the interpretive biases of law enforcement, and a subpoena request for the emails between city council members and two private developers who had lobbied for the law's passage. Asterisk. It wasn't just an attack. It was a scalpel aimed at the artery of corruption. Asterisk. When the city tried to bury it, her countersuit hit the press. An anonymous leak published the entire filing. It read like a thriller. People called it the modern Magna Carta. Asterisk. The city backed down quietly. But they knew now, Karoline Leavitt was not going away. She was a legal genius, yes. But more than that, she was a silent revolution. Not fighting to be famous, fighting to make sure everyone else didn't have to. Be a genius to survive the law. Asterisk. They started calling her the Phantom Litigator. Asterisk. Not because she disappeared, but because she appeared exactly when she was most dangerous. Asterisk. After the city quietly rolled back the public behavior ordinance, a strange fear settled in local government circles. Officials who once brushed off legal protests began triple-checking their language. City councils delayed ordinances they'd rushed through for years. Memos started to include warnings like, asterisk, ensure this won't trigger a Leavitt-style challenge. Asterisk. But Karoline wasn't challenging, not directly, not anymore. Asterisk. She had moved into a new phase, something more methodical, more organized. Asterisk. Because for all her brilliance, Karoline had always known one truth: genius alone is not a revolution. Asterisk. A revolution requires an army, so she started building one. Asterisk. It began quietly, as always. Not with recruitment drives, but with whispers. Asterisk. People began receiving mysterious packages in the mail, plain envelopes with no return address. Inside, a case study, a legal strategy map, a burner number. One message printed at the bottom: asterisk. This is not legal advice. This is legal power. Recipients included a 61-year-old grandmother fighting eviction from a gentrified neighborhood. Asterisk. A former delivery driver suing a tech company for biometric tracking without consent. Asterisk. A high school teacher who exposed misuse of school surveillance tools and was being blacklisted from future employment. Asterisk. Every single one of them followed the same formula: Karoline's methods, her tactics, her rhythm. Asterisk. And they won. Asterisk. Not all in court. Some settled. Some had charges dropped before trial. But the key was this. Asterisk. They knew the system wasn't just unfair. They knew exactly where and how to fight it. Asterisk. Karoline had created something no one in the legal world ever anticipated: a distributed network of self-trained disruptors. Asterisk. They didn't carry signs. They carried filings. Asterisk. They didn't riot. They requested depositions. Asterisk. They didn't shout. They subpoenaed, and it worked. Meanwhile, elite legal institutions were beginning to sweat. Asterisk. Professors started referencing her in ethics debates, though never by name. Asterisk. A judge in a quiet appellate court hearing whispered to a clerk, "I think this is another Levite brief." But the people who feared her most weren't in robes. They were in boardrooms. Asterisk. Because corporate lobbyists had started noticing a terrifying trend. Cases they were sure they'd win were suddenly falling apart. Environmental violations they thought were buried came back with surgical challenges. Asterisk. Union-busting strategies were dismantled with obscure labor clauses pulled from forgotten 1940s. Rulings, it was like someone had turned their playbook inside out and was using it against them. In one such case, a logistics company tried to force a community off land they'd owned for decades, citing outdated zoning codes. But just days before the court hearing, the company received a binder delivered anonymously that broke down their entire case, paragraph by paragraph. With embedded contradictions highlighted in yellow, one executive reportedly said, "It's like we were audited by a ghost with a law degree." Karoline wasn't just disrupting. She was anticipating every tactic, every pressure point, every loophole weaponized by the system. She had already mapped it. And now she was feeding that map, piece by piece, to the people the system feared. Most, the ordinary ones who refused to back down, but not everyone loved her. Inside the judicial system, factions were forming. Some admired her brilliance, whispered admiration from scholars who rarely praise anyone. Others began to plan her downfall. Private investigators were hired. One firm hired by law enforcement lobbying group spent 3 months tracking a woman they believed was Karoline. It wasn't. She had planted false leads, creating doppelgangers, proxies, false trails. Even her old apartment. Empty. A decoy. She had moved to cities away months ago, but one group almost found her. It wasn't a private firm. It was a federal task force designed to monitor domestic legal disruptors. They didn't want to arrest her. They wanted to recruit her. They sent an offer, not directly, through a quiet third party, a job, full benefits, unlimited research funding. A title that sounded official but meant only one thing. Come work for us and stop fighting us. Karoline declined, with a forward response typed on a single sheet of paper. I don't do cages. She knew what they were really asking. To contain the fire, to put the genius in a lab. To make sure she stopped giving regular people the weapons to fight back. But Karoline didn't want safety. She wanted a world where people didn't have to choose between silence and survival. And now, she had an army of silent fighters. They didn't chant in crowds. They filed lawsuits from libraries. They read footnotes instead of tweets. They fought like her, precise, cold, relentless. They weren't just challenging laws. They were rewriting the future. One paragraph at a time. Karoline Leavitt had become what no system can handle. A story that people believe more than they fear consequences. A myth that moves like a shadow. It strikes with the weight of a judge's gavel. And she wasn't finished. Not even close. The law, as an institution, rarely admits it was wrong. It rewrites, it appeals, delays. But it rarely looks in the mirror and says, we were outsmarted by a ghost. But Karoline Leavitt was no longer a ghost. Her impact had become unavoidable. And finally, the system bloated, proud, ancient, spoke her name. Not in fear. Not in awe. But in an internal memo titled Disruptive Legal Entities and Independent Operatives. She was listed as case reference, K. Leavitt, open source legal sabotage risk tier. 1, the highest risk level, above sovereign citizens, above extremist litigators. Because Karoline wasn't trying to escape the law. She was weaponizing it better than anyone else ever had. That's when the attacks changed. She was no longer being tracked. She was being countered. Judges began inserting preemptive clarifications into rulings to block anticipated challenges. Local governments began lobbying for legislation that limited the right to self-represent in complex cases, a move clearly designed to cut off Karoline's growing network. And law schools. They began whispering about her, not as a curiosity, but as a threat. One professor wrote in an anonymous journal, she exposes what we have taught students not to see, that power doesn't need permission when armed with precision. But Karoline had already anticipated this. In fact. She had predicted the exact legislative amendments 6 months earlier, and had begun training her underground network to operate under them. Her teachings evolved. Instead of just focusing on how to fight inside the courtroom, she began showing how to win before you ever step inside it. Asterisk, she taught. Asterisk. How to trap bad landlords with documented inspection chains. Asterisk. How to collapse predatory contracts using their own contradictory clauses. Asterisk. How to expose biased judges through public filing audits and shared precedent contradictions. Asterisk. Each lesson came as part of what people began calling the Leavitt curriculum, a term that trended briefly on the dark web before being pulled. Asterisk. But even as her strategy deepened, Karoline knew something was changing. The system was starting to adapt, not intelligently, not fast, like a wounded beast, slow, erratic, and dangerous. And then came the breaking point. One of her closest protégés, a soft-spoken librarian named Ezra, who had used Karoline's methods to stop a pipeline from tearing through. Indigenous land was arrested, not charged, detained, held without bond under vague federal code about infrastructure interference. The message was clear. You hit back, we'll hit harder. Asterisk. Karoline could have vanished, could have cut all ties. She didn't. She filed an amici curiae brief under her real name to the Federal Appeals Court. Asterisk. It was a move louder than any protest. A legal flare shot straight into the heart of the system, and it was brilliant. Asterisk. In the brief, she didn't just argue Ezra's innocence. Asterisk. She argued the pattern of state overreach, tying together 19 other cases across 4 states, where legal gray zones were being used to suppress public resistance under the false banner of security. Asterisk. She cited Supreme Court dissents no one had referenced in decades, and showed how they were more relevant today than ever before. Asterisk. The court had no choice but to hear the case, and for the first time, a federal bench had to say her name, out loud. On the record, asterisk. Karoline Leavitt, filing as an independent legal strategist. It echoed like a bell in a cathedral, a moment so surreal, even the courtroom transcriptionist paused, as if unsure how to spell it. That hearing was streamed. Clips went viral. Asterisk. One in particular. Asterisk. When a judge asked Karoline, now seated in the gallery, silently observing if she intended to pursue legal certification. Her response was simple. The law belongs to the people, not to those who license it. The room went dead silent. Even the opposing counsel looked shaken. Ezra was released, not fully exonerated but freed. The government dropped the infrastructure charge, citing overreach concerns. But everyone knew what really happened. They blinked. And she didn't. After that, something changed in the world of law itself. Professors started assigning her briefs as reading material, unofficially. Of course, asterisk, a few law journals wrote analyses of her style. Minimalist, aggressive, emotionally cold, structurally flawless. Asterisk. Her old court filings became digital artifacts, downloaded, studied, debated. Asterisk. And then came the hearing that changed everything. Asterisk. A landmark civil rights case, Moreno v. the state of New Colorado, involving racial profiling and illegal data aggregation. Asterisk. The plaintiffs were losing badly. Asterisk. Their lawyers were outmatched and cornered. Asterisk. Then, out of nowhere, the lead attorney submitted a motion. Asterisk. Amended argument structure, courtesy of Karoline Leavitt, acting as strategic legal advisor. Gasps in the courtroom. And then the judge approved it. Asterisk. The motion restructured the entire case. Asterisk. It drew the timeline, reorganized the evidence, and reframed the narrative using a technique Karoline called constitutional collapse points, identifying the moments where systemic failure becomes impossible to legally ignore. Asterisk. It worked. The court reversed its position. The state was forced to release thousands of pages of concealed data. 3 officers were indicted for procedural abuse. The tech company involved lost its federal contract. Asterisk. In Karoline's name? Asterisk. Now permanently recorded in one of the most influential civil rights cases of the decade. Asterisk. The system couldn't deny her anymore. She wasn't a myth. She was part of the record. Asterisk. Judges had to cite her, lawyers had to respect her, and bureaucrats. They feared her. Asterisk, because Karoline had proven what few ever dared to believe. You don't have to be licensed by the system to beat it. You just have to know it better than it knows itself. And she did. There's a moment when even the most unshakable systems realize they've underestimated their enemy. Asterisk for the American justice system. That moment came in the form of a 92-page document. Asterisk title, Collapse Protocol, a strategic deconstruction of judicial illusions. Author, unknown. But everyone knew who had written it. Asterisk Karoline Leavitt hadn't signed the document. She didn't have to. The structure, the tone, the cold clarity, it's the merciless breakdown of every flaw in modern jurisprudence. It was her fingerprint, burned into every paragraph like a silent signature. Asterisk. The document wasn't just a critique, it was a blueprint. Asterisk. It listed 5 major structural weaknesses in the modern court system. Not moral, not philosophical, architectural. The kind of things lawyers aren't taught because they're not supposed to notice. Asterisk. Each section began with the same line. Asterisk, what cannot be questioned becomes what cannot be corrected. Asterisk, from there, the collapse protocol outlined in devastating detail. 1. The bottleneck of access. How 80% of Americans can't afford basic legal defense. How pro bono systems are designed to appear virtuous while preventing meaningful disruption. Karoline proposed a self-replicating legal bot architecture designed not to give legal advice, but to generate challenges and flood courts with precision-based accountability filings. Asterisk. 2. Judicial inertia. Asterisk. How appellate courts statistically side with lower courts even when precedent is misapplied, because overturning means admitting systemic failure. A database of contradictory rulings delivered directly to case clerks via public channels, forcing courts to confront their own inconsistencies in real time. Asterisk 3. Interpretive control. Asterisk. The monopoly of interpretation, how the same law can mean wildly different things depending on the jurisdiction and the judge. Her solution? Create a shadow casebook, a decentralized archive where citizens could upload and annotate rulings, identifying patterns of political or corporate influence in judicial reasoning. Asterisk. Asterisk. For clerical sabotage. Asterisk, the hidden battlefield. How procedural errors, filing denials, and subtle delays are used to kill cases before they're even heard. Karoline's response? The mirror protocol, a strategy where each denied filing triggers 3 more filings, all procedurally correct but overwhelming in volume and scope, forcing clerks to reveal the bias in rejection patterns. 5. The legitimacy mirage. Perhaps the most dangerous section, she wrote, greater than. The greatest illusion of the law is that it is neutral. Asterisk. The greatest weapon of the law is the belief that only licensed voices can interpret it. Asterisk, remove the illusion, and you reveal the machine. Asterisk, disrupt the machine, and you restore the people. This wasn't revolution, it was surgery. Asterisk. Karoline wasn't trying to burn the system. Asterisk. She was trying to expose it so completely that it could never hide again. Asterisk. And once the collapse protocol went public, everything changed. Phase 1. Distributed disruption. Asterisk. Karoline's allies activated what they had been building for months. A network of legal insurgents embedded in ordinary life. Baristas, nurses, grad students, mechanics, each equipped with a precise role. Asterisk, filing watchdog complaints against judges who repeated procedural errors. Asterisk, submitting FOLJA requests targeting coordination between court officials and private interests. Asterisk, launching coordinated micro-litigation campaigns, not for money, but for precedent. The goal wasn't to win every case. It was to expose how many shouldn't have been dismissed. Asterisk, courts across the country began experiencing pattern failure. Cases that looked routine were suddenly triggering massive legal debates. Judges faced media pressure. Clerks leaked internal communications. Even bailiffs began talking. Karoline didn't hack the system. She made it choke on its own contradictions. Phase 2. Strategic decentralization asterisk. Karoline knew the system's next move would be simple. Centralization asterisk clamp down. Limit access. Increase complexity. Require more credentials. So she beat them to it. She launched something called the Open Docket. Asterisk a Rilligan. Encrypted platform that let users upload legal documents, compare similar cases, and access cross-linked filings. It had no official ownership. Hosted on a decentralized mesh network. Built to survive TAKEDOWNS. And within weeks, it exploded. Public defenders used it to find obscure arguments in housing law. Activists used it too. Build timelines for protest-related lawsuits. Teachers used it to challenge district retaliation. With whistleblower precedents, and all of it carried the same quiet legacy. The structure. The symmetry. The ruthlessness. Everyone knew this was Karoline's final war plan. The courts knew it too. Phase 3. Forced reckonings asterisk. That's when the counterattack turned savage. Congressional hearings were held on litigation. Abuse. Media outlets accused the movement of being a coordinated foreign op. A. Federal injunction was quietly issued against unsanctioned legal automation platforms, clearly aimed at the Open Docket. And then someone made it personal. Karoline's full name, her old job history, her family ties, leaked, smeared, twisted. The machine was trying to erase her credibility before it could erase her entirely. But Karoline had expected this. In fact, she'd been planning her next move for years. She released a video, the first and only one ever. One camera. One table, one voice. Greater than you want me to stop, then fix the system. Until then, I'll keep teaching. I don't need to be liked. I just need to be read. The video ended with a call to action. Not to protest, not to riot, but to file. 2. Speak in the language the system could not ignore. The law itself. And overnight. 10,000 new cases were filed across 20 states. Some were dismissed, some were ignored, but hundreds were heard, and dozens. One, not because they were perfect, but because Karoline had given people something they were never meant to have. Strategic legal fluency. She had turned the court system into a chessboard, and for the first time, the people weren't pawns. They were players, and she was the queen who never needed the crown. But the collapse protocol wasn't over. In the final section, not yet released. She hinted at a final move. A challenge not to a law or a judge. But to the Supreme Court itself. And when it came, it wouldn't be a lawsuit. It would be a reckoning.